There's a particular kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being physically alone. It's the loneliness of knowing that no one around you truly understands what you're going through. It's the isolation of realizing that the people you thought would be there have disappeared. Or worse, were never really there at all. And in that solitude, you face a question that Carl Jung spent his entire life exploring. What do you do when the only person you can rely on is yourself? Not in a self-help, pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of way, but in a deeper, more psychological sense. What happens when you're forced to become your own guide, your own witness, your own source of strength? Let me tell you something that might surprise you. Jung believed that some of the most important psychological work we'll ever do happens precisely when we're most alone. When no one is watching, when no one is cheering us on, when the external world has gone quiet and all that's left is the internal landscape we've been avoiding our entire lives. And if you're watching this video right now, there's a good chance you're in that place. Or you've been there, or you sense it coming. You're looking for something that goes beyond surface-level advice. You want to understand how to move forward when the scaffolding of external support has collapsed. Welcome to Deep Psyche Lab, where we explore the depths of the human mind through the lens of Carl Jung and depth psychology. I'm genuinely glad you're here because what we're going to talk about today isn't easy. It's not a quick fix, but it's real and it works, and it might be exactly what you need to hear right now. If you're new here, consider subscribing and turning on notifications, because we dive deep into these psychological territories every week. And this community is for people who aren't satisfied with shallow answers. We're after something more substantial. So let's talk about getting ahead when no one is there for you. And let's start with what Jung would call the fundamental misunderstanding of our time. The belief that we need other people to complete us, to validate us, to make us whole. Now, before you misunderstand me, Jung wasn't some cold individualist who thought human connection didn't matter. He deeply valued relationships, but he also understood something crucial. He understood that we enter this world alone. We leave it alone. And between those 2 points, there's a journey of becoming that only we can take. Other people can walk alongside us. They can support us, but they cannot do the work of individuation for us. Individuation. Let's pause on that word, because it's central to everything we're going to discuss. In Jungian psychology, individuation is the process of becoming who you truly are. Not who your parents wanted you to be, not who society says you should be, not who your trauma shaped you into, but who you actually are at the deepest level of your being. It's the lifelong process of integrating the scattered pieces of yourself into a coherent whole. And here's the thing Jung discovered through his own personal crisis, through what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. Individuation often begins in earnest when external supports fall away, when you lose the job that defined you, when the relationship that anchored you ends, when the friend group that made you feel seen dissolves, when you realize that the path everyone else is walking isn't your path at all. In 1913, Jung was 38 years old. He had everything the world told him would make him happy: professional success, a family, recognition in his field. And then it all fell apart. His relationship with Freud, who had been like a father to him, shattered. His colleagues turned away. He was professionally isolated and psychologically adrift. He began having visions, dreams, and inner experiences that terrified him. He worried he was going insane. And in that terrifying solitude, with no one to guide him, he did something extraordinary. He turned inward. He began what he called his active imagination, a process of dialoguing with the figures and forces in his own unconscious. He descended into his own psyche and mapped the territory. And from that descent, from that period of profound isolation and inner work, came everything we now know as Jungian psychology. I'm telling you this because when you're alone, when no one is there for you, you're not in some lesser state that needs to be fixed as quickly as possible. You're in the exact position Jung was in. You're at the threshold of something. The question is whether you'll cross it or spend your energy trying to recreate the external supports that have fallen away. Let's get practical about what this means. When you're alone, you're confronted with yourself in a way that's impossible when you're constantly surrounded by others. You can't escape into relationship dynamics. You can't deflect your own discomfort by focusing on someone else's problems. You can't hide behind roles like being the helpful friend, the good partner, the reliable colleague. All of those masks, all of those personas that Jung talked about, they fall away. And what's underneath? That's the question. That's where the work begins. Jung used the word persona to describe the social mask we wear, the face we present to the world. It's not fake exactly. It's necessary. You need a persona to function in society, but the problem is that most of us identify completely with our persona. We think we are the role we play. And then when circumstances change, when the audience disappears, we feel like we've disappeared too. Being alone strips away the persona, and that feels like death. But it's not death, it's revelation. You get to see what's actually there when all the performance stops. And what's there is complicated. Jung would say that beneath the persona, you'll find the shadow, all the parts of yourself you've rejected, denied, or pushed into the unconscious, the anger you weren't allowed to feel, the ambition you were taught was selfish, the vulnerability you learned was weakness, the strangeness you hid to fit in. When you're alone with no one to perform for, the shadow starts to emerge. And most people run from this. They immediately try to fill the void with new relationships, new distractions, anything to avoid facing what's inside them. But here's what Jung discovered. The shadow isn't your enemy, it's your ally. It contains not just your darkness, but your unlived life, your unclaimed power, your buried creativity. Integrating the shadow, which means acknowledging these rejected parts and bringing them into consciousness, is one of the most important steps in individuation. And you can only really do this work when you're alone. Because when other people are around, you're too busy managing their perception of you. You're too busy being likable, being appropriate, being safe. Solitude gives you permission to be whole, which means being complex, which means being contradictory, which means being human. Let me give you a concrete example. Let's say you've always been the person everyone comes to for advice. You're the helper, the nurturer, the one who puts everyone else first. That's your persona, and it's probably earned you a lot of positive feedback over the years. But then something happens. The people you helped move on. They get busy with their own lives, and suddenly you're alone and you realize that beneath that helpful persona, there's anger, resentment, a sense of depletion. Those feelings have been there all along, but you couldn't acknowledge them because they contradicted the image you needed to maintain. Now in solitude, they rise to the surface. You could judge yourself for having these feelings, or you could do what Jung would encourage you to do. Get curious. Ask yourself what the shadow feelings are trying to tell you. Maybe they're saying that your helpfulness was partly a strategy to avoid your own needs. Maybe they're pointing to boundaries you never learned to set. Maybe they're revealing a part of you that wants to be more selfish, more focused on your own path, and that's not a bad thing. That's integration. This is how you get ahead when no one is there for you. You stop running from yourself. You stop waiting for external circumstances to improve before you do the inner work. You recognize that being alone is not a problem to be solved, but an opportunity to know yourself in a way that's impossible when you're constantly entangled with others. Now, Jung would also say that you're never truly alone even when you're physically isolated. This is where his psychology gets really interesting. He believed that the psyche is inhabited by what he called autonomous complexes and archetypal figures. In simple terms, you have an inner cast of characters, not in a dissociative or pathological sense, but in the sense that different aspects of your personality have their own voice, their own perspective, their own energy. There's the inner critic, the inner child, the wise old man or woman, the hero, the rebel. These aren't metaphors, they're living psychological realities that you can actually dialogue with. When Jung was going through his crisis of solitude, he didn't just sit and think about his problems. He actively engaged with the figures that appeared in his imagination. He would close his eyes and allow images to arise. Sometimes he would see an old man who gave him wisdom, sometimes a feminine figure who challenged his assumptions. He took these encounters seriously. He wrote them down. He argued with them. He learned from them. This is what he called active imagination, and it's one of the most powerful techniques for working with the psyche when you're alone. You can do this too. It's not mystical or weird. It's psychological. When you're stuck on a problem, instead of endlessly ruminating, you can imagine sitting down with a wise figure and asking for guidance. Not because you're talking to a ghost or a spirit, but because you're accessing a part of your own psyche that holds wisdom you've accumulated over your lifetime, but can't consciously access through rational thinking alone. You can dialogue with your younger self and offer the compassion that part of you never received. You can confront your inner critic and ask where it learned to speak to you that way. You can meet the part of you that's been exiled and invite it back. This is how you build an inner community when the outer one has disappeared. You recognize that you contain multitudes, to borrow a phrase, and that you can draw on different parts of yourself for different needs. Need courage? There's an archetype for that. Need comfort? There's an inner figure who can provide it. Need truth-telling? There's a part of you that knows exactly what you've been avoiding. When you're alone, you have the space and silence to hear these voices, to sort through them, to integrate them. And here's something crucial Jung emphasized. The goal isn't to resolve all contradictions into some bland, unified self. The goal is to hold the tension of opposites, to be both strong and vulnerable, to be both independent and longing for connection, to be both confident in your path and uncertain about the future. This is what Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's ability to hold paradoxes and, through that holding, generate something new. When you're alone, you're not trying to become perfectly self-sufficient. You're learning to be at home with yourself, all of yourself, the parts that are thriving and the parts that are struggling. Let's talk about something practical that happens when you're getting ahead on your own. You start to notice that a lot of what you thought was you was actually just internalized voices from other people, your mother's anxiety, your father's ambition, your culture's definition of success, your peer group's values. When those people aren't physically present, those voices become easier to identify. You start to hear them as what they are, voices, not truths, and you get to choose which ones you want to keep and which ones need to be questioned. Jung talked about this as the process of differentiating from the collective. The collective, in his terms, is the shared psychological atmosphere of your culture, your time, your social group. It's not bad. It's where we get shared meaning, shared values, shared stories. But the collective also exerts enormous pressure to conform, to fit in, to not stand out too much. And most people never question the collective's assumptions because they're surrounded by others who reinforce those assumptions constantly. When you're alone, that reinforcement stops. You can finally ask, do I actually believe this? Is this value mine or did I just absorb it? Is this goal I'm chasing really what I want, or is it what I was told to want? This questioning can be disorienting. It can feel like you're losing your mind. But Jung would say you're not losing your mind. You're finding it. You're differentiating. You're separating what's authentically yours from what's been imposed. And once you do that, once you know what you actually value, what you actually want, what you're actually here to do, then you can move forward with clarity and purpose. You don't need constant external validation because you've found an internal compass. But let's be honest, this process is hard. It's lonely in a different way. Because once you start thinking for yourself, once you start living according to your own values, rather than the collective's, you can become alienated from the people around you. They might not understand your choices. They might think you've changed, become strange, lost your way. And in a sense, they're right. You have changed. You've become more yourself. And that's always threatening to people who are still fully identified with the collective, because your differentiation reminds them of their own unlived potential. Jung went through this. After his break with Freud, after his descent into the unconscious, he emerged with ideas that were too strange, too unscientific, too mystical for many of his colleagues. He was marginalized for years, but he kept going. He trusted his own experience. He trusted what he had discovered in his solitude. And eventually the world caught up to him, not because he compromised, but because he stayed true to what he had learned in the depths. I'm not saying you need to become some isolated hermit who rejects all human connection. That's not individuation. That's just another form of one-sidedness. What I'm saying is that the time you spend alone, the time when no one is there for you, is not wasted time. It's not empty time. It's potentially the most psychologically productive time of your life if you use it right. If you turn toward yourself instead of away, if you do the work of integration instead of waiting for external rescue. One of the most powerful ideas Jung ever articulated is the concept of the self with a capital S. This is different from the ego, the everyday sense of I that you identify with. The self, in Jung's model, is the organizing center of the entire psyche. It's the part of you that knows the whole story, that sees the pattern, that guides the process of individuation. The self is not something you create. It's something you discover. It's already there, waiting. And it often makes itself known most clearly when you're alone, when the ego's defenses are down. When you're not trying to control everything, the self communicates through dreams. Through synchronicities, through sudden insights, through the feeling that you're being guided by something larger than your conscious intentions. When you're alone and you're doing this inner work, you start to notice these communications. You start to pay attention to your dreams. You start to see meaningful coincidences. You start to trust that there's an intelligence in your psyche that's working on your behalf, even when you don't understand what it's doing. This is radically different from the modern self-help notion that you need to set goals, make plans, and hustle your way to success. Jung would say that approach is too ego-driven. It assumes that your conscious mind knows what's best for you. But the ego is limited. It can only see a tiny slice of reality. The self sees more, and sometimes getting ahead means getting out of your own way and allowing the self to lead. This requires patience. It requires trust. It requires the ability to tolerate not knowing where you're going. And that's much easier to do when you're alone, when you're not trying to explain or justify your path to anyone else. Let me share something personal. There was a period in my life when everything I had built fell apart. Career, relationship, sense of identity, all of it. And I was alone in a way I had never been before. No safety net, no one to call. Just me and the wreckage. And I went through all the stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression. But eventually I hit something deeper. I hit the question Jung was asking: who am I when all the external structures are gone? And I didn't have an answer. That not knowing was terrifying. But it was also the beginning, because in that empty space, things started to emerge. Interests I had suppressed, talents I had ignored, parts of myself I had exiled because they didn't fit the image I was trying to project. And slowly, over months and years, a new pattern began to form. Not a pattern I had consciously designed, but a pattern that felt true in a way nothing had felt true before. That's the self at work. That's individuation. And here's what's interesting. Once that process began, once I started trusting it, the right people started showing up again. Not the old people who wanted me to be who I was before. New people who resonated with who I was becoming. Jung would call this synchronicity, the meaningful coincidence that suggests a deeper order in the universe. When you're aligned with your own individuation process, when you're moving in the direction the self is pointing, the outer world begins to mirror the inner work. Opportunities appear. Connections form. Not because you're trying to make them happen, but because you're in the right place psychologically. This is how you get ahead when no one is there for you. You stop measuring progress by external metrics. You stop looking for validation from others. You start measuring progress by internal metrics. Am I more honest with myself than I was last year? Am I integrating my shadow? Am I listening to my dreams? Am I following the guidance of the self? These questions sound soft, but they're actually the hardest questions you can ask, because they require you to be brutally honest with yourself. They require you to give up the comforting lies you've been telling yourself about who you are and what you want. There's a concept in Jung's work called the dark night of the soul, borrowed from mystical traditions but deeply psychological in its implications. It's the phase of individuation where everything you believed about yourself dissolves, where you lose your way completely, where you feel like you're dying. And Jung would say that you are dying. The old you, the ego structure you built to navigate the world, is dying. It has to die, because it was too small, too rigid, too identified with external things. And in that death, if you can endure it, if you can stay with the process, something new is born. A new center, a new way of being, a new relationship to yourself and the world. This is what happens when you're alone and you choose to face yourself. You go through a kind of death and rebirth. And on the other side, you're different. You're more you, you're less defended, you're less afraid, because you've met the worst parts of yourself and survived. You've sat with your shadow and realized it's not going to destroy you. You've felt the full weight of your solitude and discovered that you can bear it. And that gives you a kind of strength that no amount of external support can provide, because it's your strength, not borrowed, not dependent on circumstances. Yours. Now, I want to address something important. None of what I'm saying means you should glorify suffering or seek out isolation. Jung wasn't a masochist. He understood that community, love, and connection are essential to human flourishing. The point isn't to become some kind of psychological island. The point is to develop a relationship with yourself that's strong enough to sustain you when external support isn't available. Because life is uncertain. People leave. Situations change. Health fails.
Careers end.
The only constant is you. And if you don't know how to be with yourself, if you don't have an inner life that can sustain you, then you're always going to be at the mercy of external circumstances. Jungian work is about building that inner resilience. It's about creating an inner world that's rich enough, deep enough, complex enough to sustain you through the inevitable periods of outer chaos. And the beautiful irony is that once you have that inner richness, you're actually better at relationships, because you're not desperately clinging to others to fill a void. You're not trying to extract meaning and validation from people who aren't equipped to give it. You come to relationships as a whole person, or at least a person who's actively working on their wholeness, and that changes everything. There's one more concept I want to leave you with. Jung talked about something called the opus, the work. In alchemical terms, which Jung drew on heavily, the opus was the process of transforming lead into gold. Psychologically, it's the process of transforming your base nature, your unconscious drives, your unintegrated complexes, into something conscious, integrated, and whole. The opus is your life's work. It's not your career, though your career might be part of it. It's the psychological and spiritual work of becoming who you're meant to be. And here's the key insight. The opus is yours alone. No one can do it for you. No one can give you shortcuts. No one can save you from it. Other people can be companions on the journey. They can offer support, wisdom, challenge, but the work itself is yours. And there will be long stretches of the opus where you're working alone, in the dark, with no immediate feedback, no visible progress, no reassurance that you're on the right path. Those stretches are the test. That's where most people give up. They go back to the collective. They settle for a smaller life. They stop asking the big questions, because the big questions are too hard to hold alone. But if you're still here, if you're still watching, my sense is that you're not most people. You're someone who's willing to do the work even when it's hard, even when you're alone, even when no one sees or understands what you're doing, and that willingness is everything, because the opus doesn't require perfection. It requires commitment. It requires showing up. It requires being honest with yourself about where you are and what you're avoiding. So when you're alone, when no one is there for you, remember this. You're not lacking something. You're not in a deficit state. You're in a crucible. The heat has been turned up. The pressure is on. And if you can stay in the process, if you can do the inner work, something is being forged. A stronger ego, a more integrated psyche, a deeper connection to the self, a clearer sense of purpose. The alchemists called it gold. Jung called it individuation. You might call it finally becoming yourself, and one day, you'll look back on this period of solitude, this time when you had to figure everything out on your own, and you'll realize it was the most important time of your life. Not because it was easy or pleasant, but because it was when you learned to stand on your own ground. When you learned to trust your own experience. When you learned to listen to the voice of the self. When you became the person you needed all along. That's how you get ahead when no one is there for you, not by pretending you don't need anyone, not by becoming hard or cynical or closed off, but by going deep, by doing the work that can only be done in solitude, by integrating what you've been avoiding, by listening to what your psyche is trying to tell you, by trusting the process of individuation even when it makes no sense to anyone else, by becoming comfortable with yourself in a way that makes external validation nice, but not necessary. By building an inner life that's so rich, so meaningful, so aligned with your deepest truth that you can navigate anything the outer world throws at you. And from that place of inner strength, from that connection to the self, you move forward, not because you have all the answers, not because you've figured everything out, but because you've learned how to trust yourself. And that trust, that relationship with your own depths, is the foundation for everything else. Before we close, I want to be clear about something. This channel is educational and not a substitute for therapy. If you're going through a crisis, if you're struggling with mental health issues, please reach out to a professional who can support you. What we talk about here is meant to complement, not replace, actual psychological care. If this video resonated with you, if it gave you something to think about or helped you see your solitude in a different light, do me a favor and hit the like button. It helps other people who need this message find it. And leave a comment with the phrase, "I am the work," if you're committing to this inner journey. I read every comment, and I love seeing this community come together around these deep ideas. If you're new to Deep Psyche Lab, consider subscribing and turning on the bell notification. We dive into Jungian psychology, depth psychology, and the hidden patterns of the human mind every single week. This is a channel for people who want to go beyond surface-level content, who want to really understand themselves, who are willing to do the uncomfortable work of individuation. And I'd be honored to have you as part of this community. Thank you for spending this time with me today. Thank you for being willing to explore these depths. And remember, when you're alone, when no one is there for you, you're not abandoned. You're invited. Invited to meet yourself. Invited to do the work. Invited to become. Until next time, keep going deeper.